listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to Delivering on Climate Change, our collective challenge. Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is by being passionate about what you are talking about. My guest today is Rachael Orr, and Rachael is the Chief Executive of Climate Outreach, which I believe is the first British charity to focus exclusively on public engagement with climate change. Rachael's job is to deliver defining overall strategy, goals and impact. Rachael has spent her career in the voluntary sector in leadership roles, combining a deep commitment to social justice and to public engagement. She has run campaigns for shelter, led programme and campaigning work at Oxfam, and currently serves as Chair of Trustees at the Refugee Council. It was her last role leading a network of housing associations that Rachael really appreciated the huge gap in public awareness and engagement on climate change. We know that housing, like many sectors, needs to decarbonise. Rachael is a mum, I believe, of 2 young children, so she's busy. But as I always say, if you want something to get done, you ask the busiest person you know. And I think that certainly gets stuff done. So welcome to Rachael.
Thanks, Hannah. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Now, Rachael, tell us a little bit about how you started in your career and what drives you and your values, because you've gone from leadership roles in housing and social justice to climate engagement. Where does that start?
So I come from a family of teachers, social workers, community development workers. So a kind of combination of sort of thoughtfulness and a passion for equality and social justice, mixed in with people who believe in rolling their sleeves up and kind of cracking on and getting stuff done. So those have been kind of guiding forces in my life growing up. And that took me after a degree in English and politics at Liverpool University to the voluntary sector. I was really lucky to start working in Shelter's press office. I was able to do a huge amount of, I think, really important and impactful work there, and also just learn a huge amount about communication, about people, and about the kind of broader sector. And then in terms of kind of moving into climate, so yes, as you mentioned, I was running a network for chief executives of place-based housing associations. So these are people running kind of, multi-million pound organisations in some of the most deprived areas in the country. And I remember about probably 4 or 5 years ago having a round table with about 20 CEOs and saying to them, what's the thing that keeps you awake at night? And I was expecting them to talk about the kind of really deep levels of poverty and deprivation, about the antisocial behaviour, about challenges around funding. And to a man and woman, they said, how on earth are we going to decarbonise all of our housing stock? Mm-hmm. And the really, really kind of wicked challenge that they felt within that was, how do we bring people with us? Mm-hmm. One brilliant leader who I worked with, she put it in a way that always kind of sticks in my head. She said, how do I sit down with a mum of 3 kids? I know that they only have 1 bedroom, so her kids are sharing a bed. How do I tell her that I might spend 10 grand on her property? Mm-hmm. She's not getting an extra bedroom. She's not getting an outside space to dry her clothes. Mm-hmm. She's getting a heat pump. How do I begin that conversation about why that's important, why that's a priority? And I thought there must be an organisation that helps people have those conversations. And I found Climate Outreach.
Aha, I see that. That's such a good point, isn't it? How it is telling that story, and how does that become necessary and important for somebody? Now, climate outreach, which takes us nicely onto defining climate outreach's unique goal in the climate and role in the climate movement. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and how you do support organisations to tell that very different story, or to tell a story, and because I know that you offer various training, research, workshops, etc.
So I think what Climate Outreach has always sought to do is to think about climate communication from listening first rather than broadcasting. And I think an awful lot of communication, especially communication that comes from campaigning organisation, that comes from people who are deeply knowledgeable and deeply passionate, often starts with talking. This is what you need to know. This is what you need to understand. And actually what a lot of really drew me into Climate Outreach was thinking, how do we start by listening? How do we start by understanding where different people are, how they see the world, how their values, the kind of that underpin all bits of their life, link to how they think and feel and understand climate change. So an awful lot of Climate Outreach's work, almost always delivered in partnership, has been building links with trade unions or the Women's Institute or communities in places, and sort of trying to understand how the people that they are working with think and feel and understand climate change, and then work with them to think about how they could maybe shift some of their communications or messaging so that it lands to a broader range of people. And then we've also done more kind of national level studies where we've kind of taken that approach but used it to do focus groups and surveys and kind of more in-depth bits of work, and then tried to produce some kind of insights and guidelines for people who are thinking about how they might alter their communications and their messaging a bit so that it can resonate with different audiences and kind of people of different backgrounds or maybe different political persuasions.
And I'm glad you've mentioned the Women's Institute, actually, because I was lucky enough to interview Emma Holland-Lindsay from the Women's Institute, and talking about that messaging and that grassroots and how you tell that message around people and where it starts and where it goes. And I think you have something called climate ambassadors. Is that right? Is that what you call it at Climate Outreach, climate ambassadors? And how does that exactly tie in with that?
We've used this kind of ambassador model in lots of different forums. We've worked on it with Women's Institute. How can their kind of sort of community leaders think of themselves in terms of their personal climate story? And we've also run a similar kind of programme with climate scientists. And that particular initiative came about because we had some climate scientists approach us and say to us, we're deeply knowledgeable and passionate about this, but we don't think we're very good sometimes at kind of, the kind of explaining and public communication about it. How can we think about the messaging that we can use to more effectively kind of talk to people about what's happening in climate science, but how it kind of connect with them? We've done some work both at a kind of social science level. So the social science will tell you that, unfortunately, facts aren't that effective as a mechanism of communication. Scientists are brilliant at facts. Knowing the facts is obviously essential, but we are social animals, and what most people want is connection and story and kind of empathy with kind of their own lives and their own kind of struggles. So our Science Ambassadors programme worked with a lot of climate scientists to help them think about how they could communicate not just the science, but like communicate as themselves as scientists. How do you, as someone who is talking about climate, bring the kind of personal dimension into it? And that's something I've certainly found kind of moving from an issue like housing. Like everybody has somewhere that they live, whether that's somewhere that's good or somewhere that's less good, whereas quite a lot of climate communication can feel very much about facts and science, and we sometimes leave the people behind. Trying to work with people about how do you bring that to the fore more? How do you bring that kind of empathy with your audience? And it was a really interesting process doing that with climate scientists. And that model is something that we do when we're, working in partnership with anyone, as I say, from kind of climate scientists or maybe to charities or community groups, community leaders as well.
Because I do speak to quite a few scientists and engineers, and we talk a lot about statistics and facts because we need those, because we need to know that things are warming up. We need to know how we're responding. But essentially, we're driven by emotion and we're driven by the heart, aren't we? And those stories. And there's a lot of social science research. So essentially, your job is to get that social science research and find the very best to tell that story, which takes us on to kind of the kinds of stories we're seeing on our news, because we see climate crisis stories regularly on our news, whether it's flooding, whether it's fires, etc. From your experience, why do you think there is such a gap in the public understanding of climate issues? And why do you think we're finding it quite hard to tell that very real climate story? Because we've got climate migration, which is a big issue. And the perception of we see the perception of climate migrants in our news as well. What are the issues around that? What advice would you give to a new organisation or to any organisation coming? Because you've also worked with The Guardian, for example, because I know you've helped shape editorial standards and guidelines at The Guardian in terms of climate photojournalism, I think. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And you've also launched a campaign called Shall We Love. So tell us how practical that is to bring those statistics to life.
The first thing I would say is people across the UK really care about climate change. They're really worried about it and they really care about it. They see those news stories of kind of climate impact, and they're worried. What a lot of people say to us is when they're worried about something, they try not to think about it. And actually, that's quite a normal human response, right? I'm quite worried that I might get cancer one day, but I don't think about it. Obviously, the people who've chosen to work on climate, we're so worried about this that it drives us to lean in more. But that's a bit of a difference. But I think it's a mistake to assume that just because people aren't talking about climate all the time, they don't know that it's important and they're not worried about it. Every time we do kind of population-wide surveys, every time we talk to people about this, people get it, they're worried about it, and they're starting to notice climate impacts, not just around the world, but locally as well. More and more people are saying, it's not just the weather, is it? My local community is flooded. I think that kind of realization is growing. I think there's a few key things. So first of all, I think it's really important that we find a way when the news is telling those stories about climate impact, that we name climate change. Some journalists, some media outlets, some weather reporters do that, but it doesn't happen across the board at all. And of course, we need to think about how we do that, and we need to do it sensitively. But I don't think it's okay anymore for us just to have kind of report after report of kind of wild weather. There needs to be more that consistently says, and these are some of the why, and this is how it links to the fact that the kind of planet is warming. We have to balance some of those stories of despair and destruction with progress, because the other thing that people don't know enough about is that we are making progress. And I also think this is a bit of a challenge for kind of climate campaigners and climate advocates, because what we feel is the progress isn't fast enough. And a lot of, what you'll get from climate campaigners is we're not doing enough, and we know we're not doing enough. But what people who don't think about this every day just hear is it's all negative. There is no positive to be had there at all. So actually, we need the stories of progress. We need to keep telling people, we've halved our emissions since the 1990s. 50% of our electricity is now powered by renewables. When you tell people that, they're like, wow, really? That's incredible. That makes me feel better. That makes me feel good. So we need to find the stories of progress, and we need to find the storytellers of progress as well. Of course, we need the scientists, but we need the innovators and the community leaders who are kind of powering the green transition as well. So I think there's definitely something about how we balance stories and the storytellers. And I think it's how we sort of, talk about that sort of honestly and kind of openly and sensitively. The vast majority of people who are moving because of climate change are doing so within their countries. Or, across country borders. They're not coming to the UK. There's a big risk around some of this that we start telling scare stories. We've got to tackle climate change so there isn't more migration. That is a terrible, terrible thing for us to be falling into the trap of doing. So I think, we how do we tell the people story and the kind of sensitive story, but also, what are the things that are resonant and relevant to people's daily lives, and how are we kind of starting more of our kind of communication and storytelling from there?
Yes. Now, you've also do work with the IPCC, which is, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Can you tell me a little bit about that work? What influence have you had there?
So that the main piece of work we did with the IPCC was a few years ago, where they kind of asked us to help shape a chapter that they were writing specifically around kind of public engagement and communication. And that was what sparked some of our partnerships with some of the scientists that I mentioned. For me, the kind of exciting thing about that was the real sort of start, I think, of a realization from that kind of broader science community that we all have a role in how we think about the kind of communication and kind of storytelling about this, and how we can help move beyond this just being a climate sector kind of story. This is now not just kind of an issue of climate change. It's kind of, it's going to fundamentally kind of affect all of our lives and jobs and communities, but also, it's going to fundamentally kind of rewire our economy. So for me, there were, obviously the kind of, privilege and prestige of being invited to kind of work with the IPCC, but actually that kind of realization from people in those kind of deeply expert policy circles about the need for and their role in thinking about how we sort of take this out kind of beyond the kind of climate science world into people's kind of everyday lives, and how we could help to kind of them think about that.
Yes. If there's one piece of advice you would give to leaders in the voluntary sector who want to focus on climate change, what would it be?
I would say three things. I'll be a bit cheeky. I'll give them three. So one is, I think, be really practical. What can you do in your business? And it's absolutely fine to start small. We say this all the time with, thinking about kind of motivating people to act, like start with things that feel like small actions and then they can grow bigger. So I think, what could you do within your organisation or your supply chain that, could make a kind of initial difference in terms of tackling climate change, reducing carbon emissions. The second thing is, I would say, talk to your staff. There will be people who work for your organisation who are really passionate about this issue, who have ideas and who would love to be consulted on what more your business can do. And I think the third thing is, don't underestimate the kind of role you have as a leader, but as a person. Like, what is your personal climate story? What does this mean to you? Like, it might not mean that much to you. I used to meet people in the housing sector and they'd be like, I'm not really bought into climate change, but this is really good for my business. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but I think like being honest about it, leaders who say, I'm doing this because my kids are on at me all the time about, why does it matter personally to you? And I think people will really kind of respect that and want to kind of come along with you if you can do that as a leader.
I think that last point is a very good point, actually, thinking again about what it means to you. And I think some of us take it for granted, don't we? Our love for the environment, our love for the planet, if we're fortunate enough, we've spent a lot of time outdoors in incredible scenery and just having great respect for that and awe for our natural world, which kind of drives us to want to protect it and safeguard it. Now, I would like to go back to you as a parent, because I'd like to know how your role, and it's the most important role, isn't it? Is how does your role as a mother influence your perspective on climate advocacy and long-term impact?
So my kids are 8 and 6 now, so it definitely sits in two camps. When they were smaller, the main camp it sat in was me going, oh my goodness, like what am I doing with my life that means that the world I'll leave my kids is one that, I think is a bit better than when I found it. Both, really locally in terms of what I'm doing in my household or in my community. But yeah, what am I doing in terms of my job? But I now find that I have two brilliantly inquisitive minds who are asking me a bunch of questions all the time about the type of car we drive and why we're taking a bike rather than taking a car. And that's amazing. And they get quite a lot of that from school. There's things that they're kind of talking about in their classrooms, which I think is fantastic. And, obviously we're talking to them at home about it. But I'm definitely starting to feel the kind of, push from them about the kind of choices that we're making as a family, which is brilliant. Occasionally uncomfortable, but really brilliant. So yeah, it's kind of twofold really. My responsibility, but then also, responding to questions and needs that they are bringing to me.
It's hard, isn't it, being a parent, especially of young children, and trying to be sustainable as well, just on a practical basis as well. It's a real challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And of course, hopefully they do correct you, because they'll walk behind you and tell you to turn off the lights and stop running the tap, and all of those things that are important. Rachel, can I ask, what next for you in your career? You've achieved so much. What next?
Thank you. I better not say too much in case my boss is listening. I'm always driven by how we can kind of have impact and bring people with us. And so right now, my job at Climate Outreach is how we can do that on as big a scale as possible, which, one of the things I really love about Climate Outreach is we always seek to work in partnership. So trying to explore kind of new partnerships, how can we get our research to people? I'm thinking about elections that are happening in the next 12 months. Who are all the campaign groups who are going to be thinking about climate in the run up to those elections? Can we help them think about their kind of messaging and their story? Thinking about what are the kind of big picture sort of stories and narratives that we might need in the UK in the next few years, and what role could Climate Outreach have in kind of sort of shaping those? I think that we are always better when kind of people who believe in the same outcomes and the same ends are kind of working together. So trying to forge some kind of partnerships sort of across the sector to keep up the momentum that we've had on kind of progress on climate, which has potentially felt a wee bit bumpy in the last few months. But I think there's so many brilliant people and there's so much energy in this sector. So trying to think about how we can be a really good partner and help sort of harness that moving forward.
I think that's certainly a great message, because it's a common thread, actually, is that togetherness and being able to achieve. And then you mentioned the word brilliance as well, because there are so many brilliant people working in this area, and together we can achieve so much more. So thank you very much to Rachael Orr, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Climate Outreach. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Today, we must act for tomorrow, adjusting our lifestyles to current and future impacts of climate change. Today, we must use our collective wisdom to deliver on our climate commitments. Today, we work for tomorrow's world. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels and to email us at podcast@salixfinance.co.uk with your ideas. Thank you very much to Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.